I knew exactly where my wife was. And with whom. The heat of anger burned in the corners of my mind as I typed the message into my phone. Every word heavy, every intention clear. When I pressed send, I felt as if I had thrown a lit match into a barrel of gasoline. They were together, and I knew she would read it while he was beside her, perhaps touching her, laughing, sharing something she should share only with me. What was that? He would ask, curious, when he saw her expression change from confidence to panic. I knew how she would react, the furtive glance, the hasty attempt to hide the screen. Let me see. He would insist, and she would hesitate, creating a tension between them that I had planned with surgical precision. The message was direct, almost cold, but loaded with impact. I hope you're enjoying yourself. I want a divorce. Just that, but enough to wreak havoc in her head. And I knew it would be the last thing she expected from me, because for all these years I had been the husband who ignored the signs, who pretended not to see, who justified absences and lame excuses. I was the man who believed that love could withstand anything. But not that. My heart was torn between the pain that was eating me up inside and the bitter satisfaction of knowing that she had finally felt some of the weight of her betrayal. It wasn't an accident, I discovered, nor a slip of the tongue. It was a calculated method, a plan that unfolded before my eyes as I put the pieces of the puzzle together. A wrong message sent to me instead of him, a nervous look when I mentioned his name casually, the perfume she never wore for me, but which seemed to persist on her clothes when she returned from work meetings. I put up with more than I should have, and maybe that's why she never imagined I would get to this point. I was always the peacemaker, the one who tried to sort things out, the one who suggested therapy when I felt the distance growing. She gave me reasons to be suspicious, but always denied it, with tears in her eyes, calling me paranoid. Don't you trust me? She'd ask, her voice breaking, manipulating my guilt like a conductor conducting an orchestra. I'm doing all this for us. For our accounts. For our future. For a long time, I believed it. I wanted to. Who doesn't? Loving someone and not believing them is like walking barefoot on glass, every step hurts, but you keep going because stopping seems worse. Until I found the proof. Small pieces of evidence that alone were nothing, but together told a story I couldn't ignore. The message on his phone, the tone too casual and intimate to be between colleagues. A hotel reservation she never mentioned. A new dress hidden in the back of the closet, still with a tag, that I'd never seen her wear. That night, something in me broke. Maybe it was the last lie she told, the last time she smiled at me as if I were the only person in her world. Maybe it was the silence in the car as she typed on her phone, the disguised smile on her lips as I drove and pretended not to notice. It was at that moment that I knew I had to act. The message I sent was just the beginning. It wasn't just about the shock she would feel when she read it. It was about what would come next. About what she would face when she returned home and discovered that I knew everything. That every detail had been meticulously planned. And, above all, that she was no longer in control. But it wasn't just her who would face the consequences. So would he. Her lover. The accomplice. The man who knew she was married and still got involved. I knew who he was, I knew where he worked, I knew what he had to lose. And as I typed that message, I thought not only of destroying their relationship, but of exposing each of them for who they really were. When she read the message, I imagined her trying to compose a response, maybe calling me, maybe even trying to deny it. But her silence spoke louder than any words. There were no calls. There were no replies. Just the darkness, the echo of my words reverberating in her mind. That night, I sat in the living room and waited. I imagined the moment when she would come home, the moment when our lives would finally collide with the truth I had discovered. Because, after all, she thought she was playing a game in which I didn't even know I was a piece. But she was wrong. And what did I find out afterwards? Well, that part is what nobody expects. Not even I was prepared for where this betrayal would take us. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support betrayal in any way. All the stories presented are fictional, created to show how betrayal can destroy lives and leave deep scars on everyone involved. Get ready for an exciting and shocking narrative, full of twists and turns and powerful lessons. Now sit back, take a deep breath and dive into this story that will stir your emotions. Good story. It was a quiet Sunday morning, the kind of day when the sunlight lazily flooded into the rooms of the house, reflecting off the perfectly organized furniture and the light wall of the living room. Lucas was sitting on the sofa, still in his crumpled pajama shirt, distractedly flipping through the pages of a newspaper. He always liked this morning routine, drinking a strong coffee while reading the news that seemed less interesting than the peace around him. In the kitchen, Clara was calmly preparing breakfast, her hair in a messy bun. She had always had a practical, almost methodical way of taking care of the little things in everyday life, but her movements had a touch of affection that Lucas admired. They had been married for 8 years, a union built on shared dreams and mutual commitments. Clara was the kind of woman who attracted glances because of the serenity she exuded. She had a warm smile and eyes that always seemed to carry a world of thoughts. Lucas, on the other hand, was meticulous and dedicated, known for his punctuality and for being a man of precise words. They both worked a lot, she as an interior designer with a passion for transforming ordinary spaces into unique places, and he as the manager of a technology company, always immersed in meetings and deadlines. The house they lived in reflected this apparent harmony. Every object seemed to have been chosen with care, from the abstract paintings that Clara loved to the technological equipment that Lucas made a point of integrating into every corner. It was a home that conveyed stability, but it also had a certain emptiness that only those who looked closely would notice. Perhaps it was the absence of children running around the corridors or the silence that prevailed on certain nights. They had talked about children, but had always put it off, prioritizing their careers and the incessant search for stability. That morning, Clara served 2 plates of toast, scrambled eggs and a bowl of fresh fruit. She sat down at the table and called Lucas in a soft voice. He folded up the newspaper and walked over to her. As they ate, they chatted about trivial things, an article he had read, her latest project, and plans for next week. It was a light conversation, as if it had been rehearsed, but they both seemed comfortable at that pace. However, there were moments of pause, when Clara's gaze wandered to the living room window, as if she were lost in a distant thought. Lucas, for his part, maintained his usual posture, but there was something in his expression that suggested a slight tension, a discomfort that he didn't express in words. These small cracks in the facade of their marriage were ignored, as if they both believed that there was nothing wrong with simply carrying on. The couple's social life was also discreet. They had dinner with friends or family from time to time, but they never stood out. Clara liked being around people, but was introspective, preferring to observe and listen. Lucas, on the other hand, had a more direct manner, always involved in discussions about business or technology. The people around them saw them as a solid couple, an exemplary union, without imagining the dilemmas they faced away from prying eyes. The following week, Clara plunged into a new project, renovating an apartment in the city center. It was an opportunity she had been planning for months, and she threw herself into it with enthusiasm. She spent hours visiting furniture stores, choosing textures and color palettes, and reviewing floor plans. This immersion in work seemed to rejuvenate her spirit, but Lucas noticed that she was spending more and more time away from home. Lucas, for his part, was facing challenges at work. An important project was overdue, and he found himself under increasing pressure to deliver results. Many nights he came home late, too tired for long conversations. When he sat next to Clara on the sofa, they both seemed to be there physically, but their thoughts were miles away. One such evening, Clara was in the kitchen when Lucas arrived. He left his briefcase in the hallway, took off his shoes and walked over to her. There was something in his gaze that seemed to seek more than a simple, good night. Perhaps it was a desire to connect, to break down that invisible barrier that had formed between them. "How was your day?" he asked, trying to sound more interested than usual. "It was good. I managed to find the perfect sofa for the project," she replied, with a quick smile before turning her attention to the tea she was preparing. "That's great. It sounds like you're really excited about this client." "Yes, it's a different project. It challenges me." Lucas hesitated, as if he wanted to say something else, but decided to let it go. He knew Clara was happy to talk about the job, but there was a part of him that wanted to hear something more personal, something that went beyond the professional. It was as if they were speaking in different languages, each trying to make themselves understood but failing to truly connect. The following weekend, they decided to go out for dinner. It was an attempt to regain the closeness that seemed to have been lost over the last few months. They chose a cozy restaurant, with low lights and soft music in the background. While they waited for their dishes, Clara mentioned a trip that some friends had planned, suggesting that perhaps they should do something similar. "It would be nice to get out of the routine," she said, swirling the wine in her glass. "Maybe," Lucas replied, although his tone didn't sound very enthusiastic. He was the kind of person who preferred to solve problems before running away from them. "Do you think we're stuck in a rut?" he asked after a moment's silence. Clara looked at him, surprised by the question. "I think so, in a way. But that's not a bad thing, is it? Routine brings security." "Yes, it does. But sometimes I wonder if it's enough." There was an awkward silence, and they both concentrated on their plates when they arrived. It wasn't an argument, but it wasn't a moment of comfort either. It was as if they both knew something was changing, but didn't know how to deal with it. That evening, back at home, Clara went up to the bedroom first, while Lucas stayed in the living room. He sat on the sofa, staring into the void. Something about her behavior seemed different, but he couldn't identify what it was. Finally, he turned off the lights and went into the bedroom, where Clara was already asleep. The routine continued, but something had changed. It was as if a cloud was hanging over them, something they both felt but couldn't name. And, while each went on with their apparently normal lives, they were both about to discover that some truths can't be hidden forever. The days went by like a tangle of commitments and silences, rehearsed choreography between Lucas and Clara, but with steps that were starting to get out of sync. Lucas spent hours at work, immersed in reports and meetings, while Clara became more and more involved in her design project. There was something almost imperceptible about their interactions, a distance that neither of them mentioned. Conversations continued, but they were superficial, as if they were both afraid to face something deeper. One Wednesday afternoon, Lucas left work early. A rare break in his routine took him to a cafe he used to frequent before his wedding. He sat by the window, watching the street go by while the strong aroma of coffee permeated the room. He thought of Clara, of how things had changed. The silence that had seemed comfortable in the early years now sounded like a barrier he didn't know how to break. Meanwhile, Clara was in a decorating store, discussing fabrics and colors with a colleague from the project. He was an architect known for his talent and discreet charm, and his comments on design always seemed to hit the right note for Clara. The professional conversation flowed easily into something more personal, with casual laughter and exchanges of glances that Clara pretended not to notice. There was nothing ostentatious there, but there was a tension in the air that she couldn't ignore. Over the next few days, Lucas noticed small changes in Clara's behavior. The messages she sent were shorter and more direct. There was a lightness in her step when she left the house, but something that seemed absent when she returned. He tried not to think about it too much, attributing it to the pressure of her work, but it was impossible not to notice the growing void between them. One evening, Lucas was in his home office revising a contract and his phone vibrated with a notification. A message from an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before opening it. The content was vague, but the clear reference to Clara made his stomach turn. There was an address and a time. Nothing more. He tried to ignore it, but unease took hold of him. He put the phone away in his pocket, trying to concentrate on his work, but his mind was stuck on that message. That same evening, Clara announced that she was having a working dinner with the project's client. She said it casually, almost indifferently, but Lucas noticed the way she avoided his eyes as she spoke. He just nodded, without question, but the tension was growing inside him. At the time indicated in the message, Lucas was sitting in his car, parked a few meters from the address provided. It was a small, cozy restaurant, with faint lights spilling out onto the sidewalk. He watched people come and go, but his attention was fixed on one specific spot. When he finally saw her, something inside him seemed to shatter. Clara entered the restaurant, accompanied by someone Lucas recognized from photos on social media. It was the fellow architect she occasionally mentioned, but never in enough detail to arouse suspicion. They were close, the closeness of someone who shares something beyond words. Lucas watched as they sat at a reserved table, laughed and exchanged glances that were impossible to ignore. Lucas stayed in the car for a long time, unable to look away. His mind was a jumble of thoughts and emotions. The trust he had in Clara, the idea that their marriage was strong enough to withstand anything, everything seemed to be falling apart. He wanted to go in, confront them, demand answers, but something held him back. Perhaps it was the desire to understand, to process what he was seeing before acting. Later that evening, Clara returned home to find Lucas sitting on the sofa, the dim light illuminating only half of his face. He didn't say anything, and she didn't try to start a conversation either. The tension in the air was palpable, but neither of them seemed willing to break it. The next morning, Lucas made a decision. He needed to know more, to confirm his suspicions before acting. He hired a private investigator, someone who could provide concrete proof of what he feared was true. The investigator was discreet and experienced, ensuring that he would bring him all the information he needed. Meanwhile, Clara continued her routine as if nothing was out of place. She was careful, but Lucas began to notice the patterns in her schedule, the messages she sent with an almost imperceptible smile on her lips. He found himself observing every detail, looking for signs he wouldn't have noticed before. 2 weeks later, the investigator handed over an envelope containing the photos and messages he had captured. Lucas felt his heart sink as he looked at the images. Clara was with the architect in various places, restaurants, cafes, even a hotel. The messages exchanged between them were intimate, leaving little room for doubt. He closed the envelope tightly, trying to control the anger and pain that threatened to overflow. That night, while Clara was in her room, Lucas sat down at his computer and typed a message. His hands were shaking, but his determination was clear. He needed to act, he needed to make Clara face the consequences of her choices. He knew that this message was the start of something bigger, something that would change everything. The silence in the house seemed thicker that night. Lucas waited in the living room, motionless, with the envelope containing the evidence of Clara's betrayal by his side. The lamp illuminated his face, showing the tension in his expression. He had rehearsed what he would say several times, but no words seemed sufficient to express the turmoil inside him. Clara arrived home a little later than usual, looking slightly distracted. When she walked into the living room and saw Lucas standing there, staring at her, she felt a chill. He rarely expected her to be awake at that hour. "Didn't you go to sleep?" she asked, trying to sound casual as she put her bag on the armchair. "We need to talk," he replied, his voice firmer than she was used to. Clara hesitated for a moment. Something in his tone made her heart race, but she disguised it with a tense smile and sat down on the opposite sofa. "What happened?" she asked, leaning forward slightly. Lucas didn't answer straight away. He picked up the envelope, slid it across the table towards her and crossed his arms, as if bracing himself for the impact. Clara looked at the object, without touching it, as if she knew that opening that envelope would mean crossing a point of no return. "What's this?" she asked, her voice almost breaking. "Evidence," he replied, the word carrying a coldness she had never heard before. "Evidence of what you've been doing behind my back." The blood drained from Clara's face, but she still tried to keep her composure. "What are you talking about? I haven't done anything." "Open the envelope, Clara," he ordered, his patience wearing thin. "Open it and tell me I'm wrong." With trembling hands, she pulled the envelope towards herself and opened it. The photos and messages fell out onto the table. Each image, each word seemed to scream at her, and she felt as if the ground was opening up under her feet. Her throat went dry as she tried to find something to say, but the words just wouldn't come. Lucas watched her, his eyes fixed on her, waiting for some reaction, a justification, anything that could explain what he was seeing. But all Clara could do was stammer, "Lucas. It's not what you think. It's not what I think." He laughed, a bitter, almost incredulous laugh. "Then explain, Clara. Tell me what it is. Because what it looks like is that you were betraying the man who loved you and trusted you." She tried to speak, but tears began to run down her face. "I never meant to hurt you." "But you did," he interrupted, his voice now full of pain. "You destroyed everything we built together. 8 years, Clara. 8 years thrown away for what? What does he have that I don't?" "It's not about that," she exclaimed, her voice raised, as if she was trying to convince herself as much as him. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I lost myself, Lucas. I felt like I was disappearing into our routine, into who we had become." "So the solution was to sleep with another man?" he retorted, his tone as sharp as a blade. "You could have talked to me, Clara. You could have said you were unhappy. But instead, you chose to betray me." She lowered her head, unable to face him. The weight of what she had done was suffocating, but there was something else she knew she needed to say, something that would make everything even worse. Lucas, seeing her hesitation, narrowed his eyes. "What else aren't you telling me? Because I can see on your face that there's more." Clara looked up, her eyes red and swollen. She opened her mouth to speak, but her voice wouldn't come out. She took a deep breath and finally whispered, "It wasn't just that." "What do you mean, it wasn't just that?" he asked, now leaning forward, his voice low but charged with tension. She closed her eyes for a moment before saying, "He's not who you think he is." Lucas frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" "He knew who you were, Lucas," she said, her voice breaking. "He knew about us. He knew everything." Her words hung in the air, as Lucas tried to process what he was hearing. "What do you mean, he knew?" Clara took a deep breath, as if preparing for a somersault. "He came to me because he wanted to get to you. He knew that you were the project manager who turned down his company's offer. That's how it all started. He approached me to get to you." Lucas remained silent, the weight of what she was saying hitting him like a punch. "So you're telling me that this betrayal wasn't just about you, it was about destroying my professional life too?" She nodded slowly, the tears flowing uncontrollably. "I didn't know at first. He was so engaging. He made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt for a long time. But then, when I realized his intentions, it was too late." Lucas stood, pacing back and forth as if the movement could help him absorb the gravity of what he was hearing. "So you didn't just betray me. You allowed him to use you as a weapon against me. Against everything I've worked for." "I swear, Lucas," I tried to finish. "I realized the mistake. But he threatened to expose everything. He said he would destroy not only you, but also my career. I was trapped." Lucas stopped and stared at her, his expression a mixture of pain and fury. "And now? Do you think that changes anything? That knowing I've been betrayed by two sides at once makes me feel less destroyed?" "I don't know," she replied, sobbing. "But I wanted you to know the truth. I can't live with it hidden anymore." Lucas shook his head, laughing bitterly. "The truth. Finally, the truth. But you know what's funny, Clara? The truth came too late. He picked up the envelope, the photos and messages, and threw everything on the table. All this? It's only the beginning. Now, I'll deal with it. And you'll live with the consequences of your choices. Clara tried to move closer, but he held up his hand, asking for distance. No. It's over. There's nothing more to say. He left the room, leaving Clara alone, surrounded by the evidence of his betrayal and the unbearable weight of the truth. Lucas stormed out of the house, letting the door slam behind him. Anger pulsed through his veins, but now it was accompanied by something even deeper, the feeling of layered betrayal. It wasn't just Clara who had deceived him, but also the man she had allowed into their lives, turning an already fragile marriage into a weapon against him. Clara's words echoed in his mind as he walked aimlessly through the deserted streets. With every step, he tried to sort out his thoughts. What would he do next? Confront his lover? Reveal everything to those close to him? Lucas knew he needed to make decisions, but at that moment, every idea seemed too sharp, too difficult to face. He finally stopped in an empty park, where the silence of the early morning and the coolness of the night air seemed to slightly calm the storm inside him. Meanwhile, Clara sat motionless on the sofa. Tears still streamed down her face, but there was something else besides despair, fear of what Lucas would do. She knew he wasn't a man of uncontrolled outbursts, but she also knew that this apparent calm could be even more devastating. She wanted to run after him, to explain more, to say something that would erase what had just happened, but it was useless. She had already crossed a line that could not be undone. The next morning, Lucas came home. His eyes were deep, as if he hadn't slept, and he hadn't. Clara was in the kitchen, holding a cup of coffee, as if it were the only thing anchoring her to reality. When she saw him, she hesitated, but tried to get closer. "Lucas, please, we need to talk." "Not now," he said coldly, walking straight past her and up the stairs. He needed a shower, he needed to pull himself together, but above all, he needed to plan. Clara stood still for a moment, feeling the weight of his indifference. He hadn't shouted, he hadn't said anything else, but that silence was like a death sentence for everything they had built. Lucas left the house again a few hours later, this time with a clear purpose. He went to the office of the man Clara had mentioned, the architect whose name was engraved in his mind as a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. The building was elegant, modern, with glass walls and minimalist lines. Lucas entered and asked to speak to him, his voice firm and without a trace of hesitation. "He's busy now," said the receptionist, casting a polite but slightly uncomfortable glance at the man in front of her. "I'll wait," Lucas replied, taking a seat in one of the lobby armchairs. He didn't care how long it took. He wouldn't leave without talking to the man. 40 minutes later, the architect appeared. He was exactly as Lucas had imagined him, confident, well-dressed, with an expression that seemed to measure every detail of the situation around him. When he saw Lucas, he hesitated for a moment, but soon regained his composure. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice calm. "Yes, you can. But I think you know why I'm here," Lucas replied, standing up. The architect took him to a private room, away from the prying eyes of the receptionist. As soon as the door closed, Lucas crossed his arms and looked directly at him. "You knew exactly what you were doing when you approached my wife. Not only did you use her, but you used our marriage as a tool to get to me. So I want you to tell me why. I want to hear it from you." The man sighed, as if the situation was less of a nuisance than it really was. "Lucas, I understand that you're angry, but things are never as simple as they seem. Clara and you have nothing," Lucas interrupted, his voice louder and more authoritative. "You took advantage of a moment of her weakness. You manipulated the whole thing. So don't come here playing the innocent." The architect took a step back, but kept his posture. "I didn't manipulate anything. Yes, I knew who you were. Yes, I had reason to feel resentful after what happened with the proposal I made to your company. But the things with Clara, they just happened. Just happened, repeated Lucas, with a bitter laugh. Did you expect me to believe that? Silence settled in for a few seconds. Lucas stepped forward, coming face to face with the man. You destroyed a marriage. You ruined something that was already on a tightrope. And for what? For revenge? For ego? I'm not going to apologize for falling in love, replied the architect, defiantly, but with a hint of hesitation in his voice. But I admit that the initial intention wasn't clean. It's just that, over time, Clara has become more than that. I care about her. Lucas felt his blood boil, but he kept control. If you really care about her, then you'll disappear. I don't care about you around her, our marriage or our life anymore. The architect opened his mouth to reply, but Lucas held up his hand, interrupting him. I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to warn you. This is your chance to get out before I destroy your life the way you tried to destroy mine. Lucas left the room without looking back, his determination unwavering. He knew that this conversation wouldn't erase the pain, but it was a start. He needed to regain control, not just over the situation, but over his own life. When he returned home, he found Clara sitting in the living room, looking at a pile of photos and papers on the table, the same evidence he had shown her the night before. She looked at him, and for a moment, the silence between them seemed to carry all the unspoken feelings. I spoke to him, said Lucas, finally breaking the silence. Clara looked up in surprise. What did you say? I said that he should stay away from us. And that if he dares come near you again, I'll make sure he regrets it. She nodded slowly, but didn't look relieved. And now, she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Now, I decide what to do about it, Lucas replied bluntly. You've thrown away our trust, Clara. You threw away what we had. And, honestly, I don't know if there's any going back. Clara tried to reply, but Lucas raised his hand again, asking for silence. Not now. I need time. And I think you do too. Without another word, he went upstairs, leaving Clara alone again. But this time, there was something different. It wasn't just the weight of guilt she carried, but the feeling that, despite everything, Lucas still had control of the situation, and she knew she could no longer predict his next steps. The days following the confrontation were filled with an almost deafening silence. Clara and Lucas coexisted under the same roof, but interactions were limited to practical, almost mechanical exchanges. Clara seemed to hesitate with every move, as if any step could make the situation worse, while Lucas kept a calculated distance, cold but not cruel. He didn't want to shout, he didn't want to argue. The anger he had felt before had turned into something deeper, a mixture of disappointment and weariness. One evening, Clara found him in the living room, sitting in front of the unlit fireplace with a glass of whiskey in his hand. He didn't drink very often, but at that moment it seemed that drink was the only company capable of sustaining the weight of his thoughts. When she came in, he looked up but said nothing. Clara felt her chest tighten, but forced herself to speak. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice almost lost in the vastness of the silence. Lucas didn't answer immediately. He tilted his head, watching her, before taking a long sip of his whiskey and setting the glass down on the table beside him. "What else is there to say?" he finally replied. "You've already told your part. I've stood up to the man who destroyed our marriage. And now we're here. What do you think will change?" Clara sat down in the armchair opposite him, holding her hands tightly, as if that would stop the trembling. "I don't expect it to fix things. I need you to know that I'm sorry. That it was all a terrible mistake, and that I'd do anything to take it back." Lucas laughed, but there was no joy in that laugh. "Go back? Of course, it would be great if life had an undo button, wouldn't it? But it doesn't, Clara. What you've done can't be erased." She felt the tears start to well up, but held them back. She didn't want to cry. She didn't want him to think that her tears were an attempt to manipulate him. I know. And I'm not asking for forgiveness now. I'm just asking for a chance to show that I can still be worthy of being by your side. Worthy? He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and looking directly at her. Do you think this is about dignity, Clara? It's not just about you. It's about us. What we were, what you've destroyed. And what I need to decide is worth rebuilding. Clara remained silent. There were no words that could fix that. She knew he was right. She knew it was her responsibility. But hearing that, seeing the pain on his face, was a punishment she wasn't prepared to bear. The next morning, Lucas left early, without saying where he was going. Clara was left alone in the house, the rooms echoing with a loneliness that seemed bigger than the structure itself. She wandered around the space, stopping off in the kitchen, the living room and their bedroom. In every corner there were memories, the laughter, the plans, the moments of intimacy that now seemed to belong to another life. She sat on the bed, holding a photo of them in a picture frame that was still on the bedside table. She wanted to believe that there was still something to be saved, but she wasn't sure if Lucas felt the same way. Lucas, for his part, went to a nearby park, a place he used to visit before he got married. It was a quiet space, with tree-lined paths and benches scattered around. He sat on one of the benches, looking out over the lake. Thoughts flowed wildly, but one question persisted in his mind: what did he really want? He knew Clara was sorry, he knew she was desperately trying to find a way back to him. But he also knew that the betrayal had left a mark that might never fade. While he was there, the phone rang. It was his sister, someone he had always had a close relationship with, but had avoided speaking to in recent days. He hesitated before answering. "Lucas, finally," she said, her voice full of concern. "I've been trying to reach you. Is everything all right?" "Not exactly," he replied, trying to sound more controlled than he really was. "I'm dealing with some things." "I figured," she said. "You know, you don't have to deal with everything yourself. I'm here if you need someone to listen." Lucas felt a twinge of relief at hearing this, but also a resistance. Part of him wanted to get it off his chest, to tell her everything, but another part feared judgment, the exposure of something so intimate. "Thank you," he said at last. "I just need time to process things." "Okay," she replied, with an understanding tone. "But don't forget that you're not alone." He disconnected the call and stared at the phone. There was something comforting about the idea of not being completely alone, but still, the decision about Clara was something he knew only he could make. That evening, he returned home to find Clara in the living room, reading a book she clearly couldn't concentrate on. When he came in, she looked up hopefully, but he didn't say anything. He just nodded, as if acknowledging her presence, and went upstairs to his room. As he prepared for bed, he found himself looking at the space next to the bed where Clara used to lie. She was still sleeping there, but the distance between them was palpable. He sighed, lay down and switched off the lights. But sleep didn't come. The next day, Lucas decided to do something he had been putting off. He made an appointment with a therapist. He needed clarity, he needed someone to help him organize the thoughts and feelings that were consuming him. In the session, he spoke for the first time about everything: the betrayal, his lover's manipulation, Clara's regret, and the confusion he felt about the future. "Do you think you still love your wife?" asked the therapist, after patiently listening to everything Lucas had to say. The question hit him like a punch. He hadn't thought about it so directly. Of course, there was love. But was it enough? He was silent for a moment before answering. "I think so," he said at last. "But I don't know if that's enough to get over what happened." "And have you thought about what would be enough?" asked the therapist. Lucas didn't have an answer to that. But he knew he needed to find out before indecision consumed him completely. The next few days were like a jigsaw puzzle whose pieces didn't seem to fit together. Clara tried to get closer to Lucas, using discreet gestures, leaving short notes, preparing meals that he liked, but he remained distant, wrapped in a wall that seemed impenetrable. The therapist had advised Lucas to think deeply about what he wanted and how her actions had shaped not only the marriage, but who he was as a person. One evening, Lucas was sitting in his office, going through the evidence he still kept in the envelope. The photos, the messages, everything seemed like a constant reminder of the pain he felt when he discovered the betrayal. He knew that keeping them was an unnecessary burden, but he also felt that discarding them would mean giving up something, even if it was control over the narrative of it all. Clara entered slowly, as if asking permission with the simple act of approaching. He noticed her, but said nothing, letting her break the silence. With trembling hands, she held something that looked like a letter. "I wrote this for you," she said, holding out the paper. "I don't know if it will help, but these are the things I couldn't say." Lucas took the letter, but didn't open it. He just nodded, indicating that he would keep it to read later. She hesitated, waiting for some word or gesture that would indicate an opening, but he remained silent. Finally, Clara left the room, the sound of her footsteps disappearing down the corridor. That same evening, Lucas read the letter. Clara's words were a mixture of regret, confession and a desperate plea for forgiveness. She admitted that she had lost her way, but she also said that she loved him deeply and wanted to fight for the marriage, even if it meant spending the rest of her life trying to win back his trust. Lucas felt something different when he read those words. It wasn't immediate forgiveness or reconciliation, but an understanding that Clara was, in fact, trying. And, for the first time, he considered the possibility that maybe there was something to be saved, even if it was only a small part of what they had been. The next morning, Lucas made a decision. He called Clara into the living room, and she came hurrying in, as if she knew that this moment would be decisive. He was sitting in his favorite armchair, with a different envelope in his hands. "This is what I've decided," he said, handing her the envelope. Clara opened it, and inside was a list of conditions, almost like a contract. "If we want to move forward, these are the things we need to do. There are no guarantees, Clara. I don't know if it will work. But if you're willing to try, that's what I need." The conditions were clear: couples therapy, a period of separation so that they could both process the events, and, above all, total honesty from then on. Clara read the list carefully, and when she had finished, she looked at Lucas with tears in her eyes. "I'll do anything," she said. "Anything to have a chance of fixing this." Lucas nodded, but there was no relief in his expression. He knew it would be a long road and that broken trust would not be restored easily, if at all. Meanwhile, the architect who had been the pivot of the betrayal was facing his own consequences. After his confrontation with Lucas, he began to lose clients. Rumors about his involvement with Clara circulated, damaging his reputation. The project he shared with her was abruptly shut down, and he found himself isolated both professionally and personally. It was the price of his choices, and he knew it. Over the next few weeks, Lucas and Clara began attending therapy together. The meetings were difficult, often painful, but they also brought out feelings that had been buried under years of routine and silence. Lucas discovered that there was still love there, but it was a love that would have to be rebuilt, brick by brick. During their temporary separation, Clara moved in with a friend. It was a period of deep reflection for both of them. Lucas, for his part, began to go out more, exploring activities that he hadn't had the time or desire to do before. On one of these outings, he met a woman in a bookstore, someone with whom he shared an unexpectedly light and amusing conversation. There was nothing more than friendship at that moment, but it was enough to remind him that he was still able to connect with someone without the weight of the past. When Clara returned home after a few weeks, things were different. There was a distance between them, but also a new willingness to talk, to listen. They knew there was no guarantee that everything would go back to normal, but for the first time there was a mutual understanding that they were both willing to try. Time passed, and their marriage changed. It was no longer what it had been, but something new, marked by scars, but also by an honesty that hadn't existed before. Lucas never forgot the betrayal, but he learned to live with it. And Clara, for her part, dedicated every day to proving that he could trust her again. In the end, Lucas and Clara's story wasn't about going back to who they were, but about finding out if they could be something different. And although the road was arduous, they both somehow found a way to move on, together, but with the knowledge that the past could never be completely erased. If you liked this story, leave a comment and tell us what you thought. Your opinion is very important. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Remember, the channel doesn't support any kind of betrayal. Our stories show the consequences that these acts can have on people's lives. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.